They said the American soldier was soft, raised on luxury, weakened by comfort, unprepared for the brutality of total war. They were catastrophically wrong. What Japanese officers discovered in the mud of Okinawa wasn't weakness. It was something far more terrifying, a military machine so sophisticated it had industrialized compassion itself. An army where the lowest-ranking medic carried miracles in his pack, where the gap between what should be possible and what actually was felt like witnessing magic. This is the story of 60 seconds that shattered everything one lieutenant thought he knew about warfare, about America, about the future. Okinawa, May 23, 1945, 3:47 in the afternoon. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka knelt in mud that smelled of cordite and rain. His hands, bound with American rope behind his back, had gone numb 20 minutes ago. The texture of the rope, machine-made, uniform stronger than anything the Imperial Army issued, pressed into his wrists like a prophecy. Beside him, Private First Class Yamato breathed in shallow gasps, his eyes fixed on a point in the distance that didn't exist. They were waiting to die. Tanaka had seen enough American films before the war to know how this worked. The victors shot the vanquished. It was the natural order of conquest, dressed up differently depending on which side held the camera. But the Americans weren't paying attention. 30 feet away, a boy, Tanaka couldn't think of him as anything else, despite the corporal's stripes, lay screaming in a way that bypassed thought and struck directly at the spine. His left leg bent at an angle legs shouldn't bend. Blood pooled in the crater where the mortar round had found him, mixing with rainwater to form a thin pink soup. The screaming had a rhythm to it, high-pitched on the inhale, guttural on the exhale, mechanical in its repetition. Tanaka had heard men die this way before. You screamed until you couldn't, and then you stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. A figure dropped beside the wounded man, with the heavy thud of equipment hitting earth. Red crosses marked his helmet, his armband, the canvas bag that seemed too large for one person to carry. The medic, Tanaka learned later his name was Robert Chen, a grocer's son from Sacramento, moved with the fluid efficiency of a man performing a drill he'd executed 1,000 times. But it was what came next that caused Tanaka's breath to catch in his throat. No fumbling with glass ampules, no flame to sterilize a needle, no morphine tablet dissolved slowly under the tongue, while the patient's screams dissolved just as slowly into whimpers. The medic pulled a metal tube from his bag, olive drab, about the size of toothpaste. Tanaka watched, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten, as the American snapped the tube's seal with a practiced twist, positioned the needle against the wounded man's thigh, directly through the fabric of his uniform. Tanaka noted, no attempt to find skin first, and squeezed. The effect was not gradual. The screaming stopped, not tapered, not diminished, stopped. The corporal's face, contorted into a mask that barely resembled human, relaxed. His breathing, which had been coming in torn gasps, steadied. His eyes, wild with pain 30 seconds ago, focused on the medic's face with something approaching clarity. "Hang on, Miller," the medic said. His voice was steady, almost bored. This was Wednesday for him. What happened next violated everything Tanaka understood about military logic. The medic took the empty metal tube, trash by any reasonable definition, and pinned it to Miller's collar. Just clipped it there, like a medal or a rank insignia. The metal caught the late afternoon light, dangling against the corporal's chest. "Why is he wearing trash?" Yamato whispered. His voice carried the same hollow quality it had held since their surrender 3 hours ago. Tanaka watched the medic work. The man had already moved past the morphine, was checking Miller's pulse, assessing the mangled leg with quick, professional touches, and suddenly, with the clarity that sometimes comes when the world you understood has completely collapsed, Tanaka saw it. "It's a system," he said aloud. The words felt strange in his mouth, as if speaking them made them more real, more impossible. A signal for the next doctor, so they don't overdose him. Even in chaos, they have order. The next part happened so quickly that Tanaka almost missed it. Almost. But he was a trained observer, had been taught since his days at the Imperial Military Academy to see, to note, to remember. His life had depended on it. His death might depend on it too, though in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Miller was pale, not the healthy pale of a man who'd spent his life indoors, but the translucent pale of a body losing the fluid that kept it alive. His lips had gone blue, his hands trembled. Tanaka had seen this before in the jungles of Guadalcanal, in the caves of Saipan. This was the moment when the body decided whether to continue or to stop. Often, it stopped. The medic pulled a cardboard box from his canvas bag. Not a wooden crate, not a metal container. Cardboard, the kind of material that dissolved in rain, that couldn't be reused, that spoke of an economy so abundant it could afford to throw containers away. He opened it with a smooth tier of perforated edges. Even the packaging was designed for speed, and removed 2 tin cans connected by a rubber tube. Tanaka leaned forward, ignoring the sharp pain in his bound wrists. The medic shook the cans, not stirred them, not mixed them with careful precision, shook them like a child with a toy. The liquid inside, Tanaka could hear it sloshing, changed consistency, became thicker, more golden, the color of life, dried plasma. Tanaka had heard of it. There had been whispers in the officers' mess, intelligence reports that seemed too fantastic to believe, rumors that the Americans had found a way to preserve blood itself, to carry it to the battlefield in packages that wouldn't spoil. The Imperial Army had dismissed it as propaganda. Blood couldn't be dried and reconstituted. It was scientifically impossible. The Americans were lying as they always lied, trying to intimidate with technological fantasies, but here it was, real, functional, being deployed by a common foot soldier in a muddy crater on Okinawa. The medic hung the bottle from a rifle, another soldier's rifle, thrust bayonet first into the earth beside Miller, and worked the needle into Miller's arm. The plasma began to flow. Tanaka could see it, a golden thread connecting the bottle to the vein, carrying life from one vessel to another. In the Imperial Army, a wound like Miller's in the jungle was a death sentence. You tourniquet if you could, said your prayers, and waited. Perhaps if you were very lucky and very well connected, you might be carried to a field hospital where a surgeon with inadequate supplies and exhausted hands might attempt something heroic. Here, a single enlisted man carried a hospital in his bag. He was pouring life back into his comrade's veins in the dirt, under fire, as casually as another man might pour tea. The sound of an engine cut through the afternoon. A jeep, another word Tanaka had learned from captured documents, never quite believing it referred to a real vehicle, roared out of the tree line. It moved fast, too fast for the terrain, bouncing over roots and rocks with a suspension system that absorbed punishment the way the American military seemed to absorb everything: casualties, setbacks, distances, time. 2 men jumped out before the vehicle fully stopped. They carried a stretcher between them, not bamboo and canvas, not improvised from rifle straps and shelter halves. A proper stretcher, aluminum frame, reinforced fabric, designed and manufactured for exactly this purpose. They loaded Miller with mechanical efficiency, lifted him onto the stretcher, plasma bottle still attached, still flowing, and secured him with canvas straps. The whole operation took less than 90 seconds from the moment the jeep arrived to the moment it departed. As it drove away, Tanaka caught a glimpse of Miller's face. He was conscious, watching the trees pass. He would live. The medic stood, brushing mud from his knees. He pulled a white packet from his pocket, paper and foil, Tanaka noted, not cloth, and extracted a cigarette. American tobacco. The smell of it, rich and sweet, drifted across the crater. The medic lit it with a metal lighter that sparked on the first try. He inhaled deeply, held it, released the smoke in a thin stream toward the darkening sky. Then he turned and saw the prisoners. Tanaka tensed. This was the moment. The medic would walk away or he would walk closer, and either way, what happened next would define whether Tanaka saw another sunrise. He felt Yamato trembling beside him. The American walked closer. His boots, leather, Tanaka noted, not cloth, with rubber soles that gripped the mud, stopped 3 feet away. Up close, the medic looked tired, not exhausted, not broken, just tired, the way a man looks at the end of a long shift doing work he's done many times before. He couldn't have been older than 25. His eyes settled on Tanaka's forehead. The gash there, a souvenir from the artillery barrage that had ended their resistance, had stopped bleeding, but the torn skin gaped open, exposing white flesh beneath. It should have been cleaned hours ago. It should have been stitched. It would almost certainly become infected, the way every wound became infected in the Pacific, where bacteria lived in the soil and the air and the water, waiting. The medic sighed, took another drag from his cigarette. Then, with the same casual efficiency he'd shown treating Miller, he knelt beside Tanaka. From his bag came another packet, paper this time, with English words Tanaka couldn't read. The medic tore it open with his teeth, revealing white powder inside. Sulfa powder. Tanaka had heard of it too, another American miracle drug that the Imperial Army's Medical Corps insisted was exaggerated propaganda. The medic tilted Tanaka's head back with one hand, not roughly, not gently, just functionally, and sprinkled the powder directly into the wound. It burned, a clean chemical burn that felt nothing like infection and everything like medicine. The medic wasn't finished. Another packet, this one revealing an adhesive bandage, not torn cloth tied with string, not repurposed silk from a parachute, a manufactured medical bandage, perfectly sterile, individually wrapped, designed to seal and protect. The American pressed it over the wound with practiced pressure, smoothing the edges to ensure adhesion. "You'll live," he muttered. He stood, walked back to his cigarette, left burning on a rock, and took another drag. Didn't look back, didn't wait for thanks, just stood there, smoking, watching the tree line where the jeep had disappeared, probably wondering how many more wounded there would be before nightfall. Tanaka stared at the bandage on his wrist. White, clean, impossible. An enemy soldier in the middle of a battle had treated a prisoner's minor wound with medical supplies that exceeded anything available to most Imperial Army field hospitals. Had done it without thought, without ceremony, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to waste valuable resources on a man who hours ago had been trying to kill him. "We were fools, Yamato," Tanaka whispered. Yamato turned to look at him. His face was blank, the face of a man whose reality has been so thoroughly demolished that expression no longer serves a purpose. "We fought with spirit," Tanaka continued. The words came slowly, each one weighted with the depth of a certainty he'd carried since his first day at the academy. "They fought with industry." The phrase haunted him through the processing camp, through the interrogation, through the long months of captivity that followed. We fought with spirit. They fought with industry. It became a kind of mantra, a lens through which everything else came into focus. The food, for instance. Tanaka had expected starvation. The Imperial Army had been quite clear in its instructions. The Americans were demons who would torture prisoners, starve them, work them to death. Better to die with honor than endure the degradation of captivity. It was one of the reasons so few Japanese soldiers surrendered. Death was preferable to what came after, but the meals arrived with mechanical regularity, twice a day, sometimes 3 times. Not rice. The prisoners mourned the lack of rice, but food. Abundant, strange, overwhelming food. The first meal Tanaka received consisted of a tin can labeled Rations C, United States Army. He opened it with the provided opener, a tiny, clever device that worked on the first try, to find meat and beans. Actual meat. Not the occasional fish head or vegetable ration that the Imperial Army provided when supplies permitted, but chunks of beef in a thick sauce. The portions were enormous. A single can contained more calories than Tanaka had eaten in some entire days during the Okinawa campaign, and there were 2 cans per meal, plus crackers, plus a fruit tin, peaches and syrup, impossibly sweet, plus powdered drink mix, plus cigarettes, plus chewing gum, that peculiarly American substance that served no purpose Tanaka could discern except to occupy the mouth. He couldn't finish it. Neither could Yamato or most of the other prisoners who'd spent the last months slowly starving on an island where the Imperial Army had long since exhausted its supply chain. They ate what they could, marveling at the waste, and watched as American soldiers collected the leftovers and dumped them, just threw them away, tons of food, as if the ocean might deliver more tomorrow, as if scarcity were a problem that had been solved. It was the casualness of the waste that struck Tanaka hardest. The Americans weren't hoarding, weren't rationing, weren't treating each morsel as precious. They were discarding food because they had more than they could eat and no reason to save it. The logistics of that, the ships, the supply chains, the agricultural capacity to overproduce on such a scale, suggested an economic engine that the Imperial General Staff had either fundamentally misunderstood or deliberately obscured. The processing camp itself reinforced the lesson. Rows of tents, all identical, all manufactured to exact specifications. Electric lights powered by portable generators. Water purification systems that turned brackish field water into something drinkable. Medical supplies in quantities that would have equipped a small hospital. And everywhere, the casual abundance of industrial production. Standardized equipment, mass-produced materials, replaceable parts. One afternoon, Tanaka watched 2 American soldiers replace a damaged tent pole. The old pole, slightly bent but still functional, went into a discard pile. The new pole came from a stack of identical poles, each marked with the same manufacturing specifications, each interchangeable with any other. No craftsman had carved these poles. No artisan had fitted them. A factory somewhere, probably in Ohio or Michigan or one of those American industrial centers Tanaka had seen in pre-war newsreels, had stamped them out by the thousands, all identical, all adequate, all replaceable. The Imperial Army would have repaired the bent pole, would have straightened it, reinforced it, used it until it splintered. Not because Japanese soldiers were more frugal or more resourceful, but because replacement poles didn't exist. Every piece of equipment was precious because production capacity was limited. You made do because making new wasn't an option. The Americans made new because making do was inefficient. The interrogations began in the second week. Tanaka was brought to a tent where a Nisei translator and an American intelligence officer waited. The officer's name was Captain Morrison. He was 43 years old, Tanaka learned later, a former insurance adjuster from Cleveland who'd been drafted into military intelligence because he could read maps and write clear reports. He approached the interrogation with the methodical boredom of a man filling out forms. "Name, rank, unit," Morrison said through the translator. His voice carried no hostility, no threat. This was paperwork. Tanaka provided the information. He'd been trained to resist interrogation, to endure torture, to protect military secrets even unto death. But Morrison didn't torture. He didn't even threaten. He asked questions, noted answers, moved to the next question. When Tanaka declined to answer something, Morrison shrugged and wrote, declined to state in his notebook. Then asked the next question. It was deeply anticlimactic. What broke Tanaka, and he realized later that it was a kind of breaking, though not the kind he'd been trained to resist, was the maps. Morrison had detailed maps of Okinawa spread across the table, not hand-drawn sketches, not reconnaissance reports compiled from pilot observations. Detailed, accurate maps showing terrain, fortifications, supply routes, command positions. Some of the fortifications marked on these maps were ones Tanaka's own unit had built. Secret positions, hidden caves, ammunition dumps concealed with elaborate camouflage. The Americans knew, had known, probably for weeks, had photographed from the air, had analyzed, had catalogued. And yet they'd still attacked in the straightforward, grinding manner they always attacked, with overwhelming force, abundant supplies, and mechanical persistence. They hadn't needed to be clever, hadn't needed to outthink or outmaneuver. They'd simply had more shells, more men, more time, and they'd applied that surplus until resistance became impossible. "How long did you observe the American positions?" Morrison asked. "Several weeks," Tanaka replied. There seemed little point in concealment. "What were your conclusions?" Tanaka hesitated. This was the question that mattered, though he wasn't sure why Morrison cared. The war was effectively over. What difference did one lieutenant's observations make? "I concluded," Tanaka said slowly, "that you possessed certain technological advantages." Morrison looked up from his notebook, such as medical capabilities, plasma, morphine syrettes, sulfa drugs. What else? Communications. Your radios were more reliable, more portable. Logistics. Your supply chain delivered materials we couldn't access, even in rear areas. Morrison wrote this down, then asked almost offhandedly, "Did you believe you could win?" The question hung in the air. The translator, a young Nisei named Edward Takahashi, whose parents had immigrated from Hiroshima in 1923, waited patiently for Tanaka's response. "Yes," Tanaka said, "until Okinawa, I believed we could win. And now? Now I believe we cannot lose." Morrison's pen stopped. He looked up, genuinely curious for the first time. "You believe you cannot lose, not we, you." Tanaka struggled to find words in Japanese that would translate his meaning properly. A nation that equips its common soldiers with dried plasma cannot be defeated by a nation that struggles to feed its troops. The gap is not tactical, it is fundamental. Morrison wrote this down, his expression neutral, but Tanaka saw something flicker across the captain's face. Recognition, perhaps. Or vindication. The look of a man whose private analysis had just been confirmed by enemy testimony. "Anything else?" Morrison asked. "Yes," Tanaka said. He leaned forward, suddenly urgent in a way that surprised him. "The morphine syrettes, the ones you pinned to the wounded soldier's collar." "What about them?" "That is genius. That is system thinking. That is the mentality that wins wars." Tanaka's voice rose slightly. Takahashi, translating, captured the intensity. "You have thought through the entire chain of treatment. Battlefield medic to field hospital to surgery. Each person in the chain needs to know what the previous person did. So you design a system. You make it foolproof. You pin the evidence to the patient's body. Even in chaos, even in combat, the system works." Morrison was staring at him now, pen forgotten. "The Imperial Army would have issued regulations," Tanaka continued, "would have required detailed documentation, would have assumed each medic carried a notebook and had time to write reports. Your system assumes chaos, assumes reality, assumes the man treating the wound has seconds, not minutes, and needs information immediately. That is why you will win, not because you are braver, not because your soldiers are better, because your systems account for human limitation and design around it. There was a long silence. Morrison wrote for several minutes, covering 2 full pages of his notebook. When he finished, he looked up at Tanaka with something approaching respect. "Thank you, Lieutenant," he said through Takahashi. "That's very helpful." Tanaka was dismissed. As he walked back to the prisoner compound, the afternoon sun warm on his back, through the clean camp shirt the Americans had provided, he felt something he hadn't expected: relief. He'd spoken a truth that needed speaking, had articulated an understanding that the Imperial General Staff would never acknowledge. Japan could not win this war because Japan was fighting with the tools of the previous century against an opponent who had invented the next one. News of surrender reached the camp on August 15th. The prisoners were assembled in the main yard, where Morrison read the Emperor's rescript through Takahashi's translation. Tanaka listened to Hirohito's voice, thin, reedy, barely audible through the radio's static, announce the war's end. The phrasing was elegant, the meaning was absolute. Japan had lost. Around him, prisoners wept. Some cried openly, shoulders shaking with sobs they'd suppressed for months. Others stood rigid, faces blank, processing a reality that invalidated everything they'd believed, everything they'd sacrificed. A few collapsed. One man screamed. Yamato simply sat down in the dirt and stared at his hands. Tanaka felt nothing, or rather, he felt nothing new. The war had ended for him in May, in a crater on Okinawa, watching an American medic pin an empty morphine syrette to a wounded soldier's collar. Everything since had been aftermath. What he felt now was curiosity. What came next? The Emperor had announced Japan's surrender, but what did that mean? Occupation? Destruction? The Soviets had entered Manchuria, he'd heard through camp rumors. Would Japan be divided like Germany? Would the imperial system survive? Would he ever see Tokyo again, or would he die here, a permanent prisoner in this strange land of abundance? The answers began arriving within days. Ships came, more ships than Tanaka had believed existed. They brought food, not survival rations, but feast-level supplies, fresh fruit, real vegetables, meat. They brought medical personnel who examined each prisoner, treated diseases, extracted infected teeth, distributed vitamins. They brought news, atomic bombs, cities destroyed, casualty numbers that seemed impossible, a new weapon that changed the fundamental mathematics of war. And they brought something else. Something Tanaka hadn't expected and didn't know how to process. They brought kindness, not pity, not condescension, not the performative mercy of victors demonstrating superiority, just straightforward, practical kindness. The camp commander, a Colonel Patterson, career Army, 2 years from retirement, instituted English classes, organized recreational activities, allowed prisoners to write letters home, established a system where prisoners could earn small wages for work assignments which they could spend at a camp store stocked with newspapers, books, writing supplies, and luxury items that most Japanese civilians hadn't seen in years. It was, Tanaka realized, the same systematic approach to everything else. The Americans had identified a problem: tens of thousands of Japanese prisoners awaiting repatriation. They'd analyze the problem, keep prisoners healthy, occupied, and informed to prevent unrest and disease. They'd designed systems: food distribution, medical care, education, communication. And they'd implemented these systems with the same industrial efficiency they applied to warfare. One morning in September, Tanaka was assigned to help unload a supply truck. He worked alongside an American private named Samuel Cohen, a jeweler's son from Brooklyn who spoke enough Yiddish that his English had a cadence Tanaka found strangely musical. They moved crates in comfortable silence until Cohen, sweating in the morning heat, pulled 2 bottles of Coca-Cola from a cooler and offered one to Tanaka. "Here," Cohen said, "you look like you could use this." Tanaka took the bottle. The glass was cold, beaded with condensation. He opened it with the provided opener and took a tentative sip. The taste exploded on his tongue. Sweet, fizzy, incomprehensible. He'd heard of Coca-Cola. Everyone in Japan had before the war, when American products still flowed freely, but he'd never tasted it. Officers' privilege had been sake, not soda. Good, right? Cohen grinned. They ship this stuff everywhere. My unit in France, we had Coke. My buddy in the Philippines, they had Coke. You could be on the moon, the army would figure out how to get you Coke. Tanaka believed him. The American military's ability to deliver non-essential luxury items to combat zones spoke to a logistics capability that exceeded anything the Imperial Army had achieved, even for essential supplies. During the Okinawa campaign, Tanaka's unit had gone 3 weeks without resupply. They'd eaten whatever they could forage, drank from questionable water sources, rationed ammunition until each bullet became a moral decision. And here, in a prisoner camp, in what should have been a low-priority backwater, Coca-Cola arrived on schedule. "How do you do it?" Tanaka asked in halting English. He'd been attending the camp's English classes, was beginning to assemble simple sentences. "Do what?" "All this." Tanaka gestured at the truck, the supplies, the camp, the bottle in his hand. "How do you make so much?" Cohen shrugged. "Factories, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Chicago. You need 10,000 trucks. Detroit makes trucks. You need 1,000,000 rifles. Pittsburgh makes rifles. You need Coke?" He raised his bottle in salute. "Atlanta makes Coke. It's just what we do." "Just what we do." The phrase echoed in Tanaka's mind as he drank the sweet, cold soda. That was the fundamental difference. For Japan, total war had meant total mobilization. Every resource strained to breaking, every factory repurposed, every civilian sacrifice demanded. For America, total war had meant industrial acceleration. Factories that already existed expanded. Production lines that already functioned scaled up. An economy so abundant that it could fight a global war while maintaining, even improving, civilian living standards. Japan had been fighting from scarcity. America had been fighting from surplus. And surplus, Tanaka now understood, was the only reliable foundation for victory. Repatriation came in October. Tanaka boarded a Liberty ship, another mass-produced American miracle. Ships built so quickly they sometimes sank from structural failures, but built in such quantities that the losses barely mattered, bound for Yokohama. The voyage took 3 weeks. He spent most of it on deck, watching the Pacific roll past, thinking about what he would find when he arrived home. Tokyo had burned, he'd heard. The firebombing campaign had destroyed 16 square miles of the city center. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had simply disappeared, ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. The casualty numbers were still being compiled, but early estimates suggested more than 200,000 dead from the atomic bombs alone. The conventional bombing had killed even more. What would be left? What kind of nation would emerge from such devastation? The ship approached Yokohama harbor on a gray morning in late October. Tanaka stood at the rail, watching his homeland materialize through the mist. The harbor was crowded with American ships, destroyers, transports, supply vessels, all flying the stars and stripes. On shore, American MPs directed traffic. American engineers operated cranes. American supply officers oversaw the unloading of cargo that would, Tanaka knew, feed Japan through the coming winter. The occupation had begun. As Tanaka walked down the gangplank onto Japanese soil for the first time in 2 years, he felt Yamato beside him. They'd barely spoken during the voyage, each man wrapped in private thoughts about uncertain futures. But now, standing on the dock, watching American soldiers distribute food to Japanese civilians who bowed in gratitude, Yamato finally broke his silence. "What do we do now?" he asked. His voice was small, defeated. Tanaka watched an American sergeant hand a crate of supplies to an elderly Japanese woman. She accepted it with deep bows, tears streaming down her face. The sergeant nodded awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with the deference, and moved on to the next person. The transaction took perhaps 30 seconds. It spoke volumes about how the next decade would unfold. "We learn," Tanaka said quietly. "We watch them. We understand what they understand, and then we build it ourselves." "Build what?" "Everything." Tanaka gestured at the harbor, the ships, the organized chaos of reconstruction beginning, the systems, the industry, the abundance. "They have shown us the future. We learn it, we master it, we become it." Yamato looked skeptical. "That could take generations." "Yes," Tanaka agreed, "it probably will." But even as he said it, Tanaka felt something he hadn't experienced since before the war. Hope. Not the desperate, fragile hope of a cornered nation fighting for survival. Something different. Harder, more practical. The hope of a man who had seen the gap between what was and what could be, and who now understood that gaps could be bridged through systematic effort, applied over time with intelligence and will. He thought of the morphine syrette pinned to Miller's collar, that simple, elegant solution to a complex problem. That was the mentality Japan needed to learn, not the weapon itself, but the thinking behind it. The ability to analyze a problem, design a system, implement a solution, and do it all with the assumption that resources existed to support good ideas. Japan had those resources, Tanaka thought, or would. The cities were burned, but the people remained. The factories were destroyed, but the engineers who designed them had survived. The empire was broken, but the nation endured. And now, for the first time in decades, Japan would have teachers, would have examples, would have access to the very systems that had defeated it. The Americans, in their strange, practical way, seemed determined to help. Not from altruism, Tanaka wasn't naive, but from the same systematic thinking that informed everything else they did. A prosperous, stable Japan served American interests better than a devastated, resentful one. So they would invest, would rebuild, would share technology and knowledge and organizational methods, and Japan would learn, would study, would adapt, would take the lessons of defeat and transform them into the foundation for something new. It would take decades, it would require humility, it would demand that everything Japan thought it knew about itself be questioned, examined, and often discarded. But it was possible. Tanaka knew it was possible because he'd seen it, had experienced it, had lived through the collision of two different ways of organizing human effort, and had watched one of them simply overwhelm the other through sheer systematic superiority. "We should go," Yamato said. "Find our families, see what's left." "Yes," Tanaka said, but he didn't move immediately. He stood on the dock a moment longer, watching American soldiers work, watching Japanese civilians receive aid, watching the machinery of occupation and reconstruction begin its slow, methodical operation. Somewhere in Okinawa, probably in a mass grave or a jungle clearing, lay the body of Corporal Miller. Or perhaps he'd survived. Perhaps he'd gone home to wherever American soldiers went home to, carrying a scar on his leg and a story about the time a medic saved his life with a metal tube of morphine and a bottle of dried plasma. Perhaps he thought about it sometimes, perhaps he didn't. But Tanaka thought about it, would think about it for the rest of his life. That moment in the mud, that revelation in the crater, that instant when everything he believed about how the world worked shattered and reformed into something truer, harder, more useful. We fought with spirit, they fought with industry. The lesson had been expensive, millions dead, cities burned, an empire destroyed. But it was learned. And learning, Tanaka thought as he finally turned away from the harbor, and toward the uncertain road home was the only victory that mattered now.